Thank you. And the other disclaimer at the beginning I would like to make is that my apologies, but I can't carry on the discussion in German. I mean, I can follow things, but I am nobody when it comes to functioning in taking on questions and developing arguments. So if you have any comments or questions, I'm more than really happy to have them. One of the reasons why I'm here is because I would love to have your feedback on this because this is work in progress. Okay, my official name is Erzsébet Barát. Okay, but everyone calls me Jaja. Okay, like the crazy Jaja Gabor. Okay, who was not that crazy actually, as the general, miss around her would have it. Okay, and above all, I would like to start with a big thank you that I owe to Barbara Reiter because it was her idea back in March when we both happened to go to the same conference in Warsaw that was organized by the Maria Grzegorziewska University. Sorry. And then she listened to an earlier version of this talk, and she said, like, well, you should come and deliver this talk at the annual symposium of the Austrian women philosophers. We will see. And we will see because I am not a philosopher by profession. Okay? What I do is critical discourse analysis and gender studies. So I'm a feminist scholar whose interest is in exploring the relationship between language use, power relations, and ideologies. And I usually do that from a feminist perspective. Like what feminist perspective? It varies, but usually it is queer feminism or trans feminism. Definitely not radical feminism or liberal feminism, yes, or anything of the kind, okay? And what I have come up with integrating these different scholarly fields is how to conceptualize from a different perspective of disability that would go beyond its, in my understanding, imaginary promise of curing. In other words, how to move from a discourse of medicine to a discourse of politics. Mm-hmm. So a much more social approach to it and like inserting it back into its very complex social cultural context. Right. So the cultural event that attracted my attention and allowed me to come along to your symposium is the French movie Anatomy of a Fall from 2023. It won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival last May, and it's basically a court investigation of a family drama. Samuel, the husband, is French, and Sandra, the wife, is German, and they are interacting mostly in English. They are both writers and just moved back from London to some family chalet in the French Alps, trying to save their marriage on the rocks. It's mostly on the rocks due to the husband's writerly block and low self-esteem problems vis-a-vis the successful wife. One day, a woman graduate student, comes along to make an interview with Sandra, but their conversation is drowned out by the noises from above, some loud rock music played with a thunderous boom by the husband, deliberately sabotaging the interview. Sandra arranges a different date and goes to take a nap. In the meantime, Samuel falls out of the window of the family home and dies, but is discovered to have sustained a head wound before his body hit the ground. The couple has a son, the 11-year-old Daniel, whose vision is impaired in the wake of a family car accident. He is the only person at home during the tragedy. The boy can conjure up the events through the sound effects and acts as the crown witness in his mother's case. The court case evolves around the apparently evolves around the questions: did the husband tumble over the balcony or was he pushed? Did he hit his head on the edge of the shed below in his fall, or had the blow already been struck? Sandra, the wife, is indicted on charges of homicide. The spectator, however, is invited to assume the boy's perspective. We become the detectives with him around the question, I have to understand. What demands clarification for the boy is not only the fall, but much more the state of his parents' marriage, and through that, his relationship with the parents. So, although half of the movie is set in the courtroom, the narrative is not organized by the machinery of the law, but much more by the boy's emotional need to understand. And that understanding, as we know, is always a dialectic of both seeing and failing to see, to use a matching metaphor, for the problematic. So, to show how the intellectual seeing works, I have chosen a powerful scene in the court hearing, one that foregrounds the ideology of cure and has the capacity to provoke that promise. In the scene, the widowed wife, Sandra's claim to innocence, is challenged by the prosecution because of the arguably limited value of her son's recollections of the events preceding the father's death. The boy's testimony cannot really count, says the prosecutor, due to his blindness. Daniel is sitting in the courtroom throughout the trial, so at this very moment as well. It is unnerving for the mother and, with her, for the spectator to understand that the boy is exposed to the prosecution's judgment on his capacities. In the scene, the mother is disturbed not that much by the fact that the discreditation of Daniel's testimony entails her accusation of murder, but by the assumption informing the lawyer's dismissal of Daniel's testimony. According to that dominant logic, one can only succeed in life if we are able-bodied or can overcome a disability. In the prosecution's view, it is clearly not the case in Daniel's life because his vision is impaired now for the rest of his life. So there is no cure for him on the horizon. The mother immediately interrupts the lawyer and stands up without invitation to protest that logic. Sandra is underscoring that ever since the family car accident resulting in Daniel's impairment, she has made sure that Daniel would never think that he should be living an imperfect life as a visually impaired boy. His life is as valuable as any other kid's life of his age. He can play the piano, he can go on walks on the hillside with his guide dog, and he has grown into a confident adolescent. The viewer is invited to immediately add, so much so that Daniel is proven able to take the hostile cross-questioning much more than many adult witnesses could do. The spectator will know that this is a crucial point for the mother, well beyond the court case, because at this point she switches into English, her language of public communication, breaking the court's expectation that she should speak French while on trial. Although I am suspicious of the director's use of code switching, as it is against the existing policies on providing court interpreters, I understand that the director opted for this unwarranted solution to further underscore the relevance of the scene in the film narrative. So the question is, how can we read the scene and the director's decisions? I would like to ask a couple of important questions to explore this and to reflect on the mother's counter-hegemonic understanding of inclusivity in the scene. How could we foster a positive space in the face of rejection and hostility that is brought about by the normalization of ability? How could we subvert the logic that links defects, impairments with the need for cure, or else we are leaving the body open to shame? I argue that for such a move, we need to challenge the understanding that disability equals deficit, and it's only naturally desirable for one to be cured of it. Where can we turn to find the logic that moves beyond the perspective of perfection? I think we may find that logic granting that all forms of personhood are equal of value, and we can go beyond the routine ideology of ableism if we turn to transfeminism. I think what the mother challenges is the humanistic ideology of cure and the imaginary social order repaired in its wake. Her protest articulates the perspective that Ellie Kerr, the trans studies scholar, in their 2017 book calls brilliant imperfection. I shall point out three key elements that need to be subverted for a shift towards a favorable discourse of naming in of brilliant imperfection. Furthermore, I think the challenge can be linked with Jasbir Puar's preference for the term creep bodies, creep lives, instead of disabled bodies, and therefore disabled lives. Puar points out that the dominant act of naming is a move that routinely devisibilizes maimed bodies precisely because debility is profitable for neoliberal capitalism. The biopolitics of neoliberal capitalism relies on technologies that necessitate effective dimensions of control as ways of undermining biopolitical agency. And it is this investment that naturalizes the desirability of repair. Puar's introduction of debility, I believe, pushes us to think disability as a matter of social justice instead of its medicalization. I am certainly not arguing in favor of some unconditional anti-cure politics of embodiment. I am not arguing that one should not ever seek bodily change and treatment. What I am arguing for is a different logic informing the ways we name those needs and desires beyond medicalization. I am arguing for a logic that challenges and escapes the assumptions of normal and natural evoked by the fetishization of cure that implicates certain bodily existence as disabled, imperfect, defected, and as such only desirable to be mended. So, I think the mother in the courtroom is resisting the shame that is routinely reiterated by the prosecutor's judgment of her son's impaired vision that tries to medicalize Daniel's sense of identity into one of imperfection. Her intervention shuts up the dominant logic that tries to get in the way of the boy's coming home to his body. More broadly, what is at stake in her protest is fighting for their parental understanding that their son's body is not irrevocably different and less of value from how he used to be before the accident. And most importantly, fighting for protecting their success at passing on that understanding to the boy. However, we are not told anything or shown any flashbacks about the actual education that the parents took up after the accident. The spectator can assess the parent's efforts or its success through the self-confidence of the boy in the courtroom, and of which we are reminded at this point by the upset of the mother. In fact, we, the viewers, are made aware of how much effort that education must have entailed only through the mediation of the mother's frustration. The more frustrated she comes across, the more work seems to be at stake. Up to this point, we are not reminded of Daniel's impaired vision through any diagnosis that could trigger our sympathy, precisely because both the film narrative and its visuality sidestep such disabling consequences. The inclusivity of the film, I argue, consists in inviting the viewer to tacitly understand that Daniel's bodily life is irrevocably different from others, but without associating his life with the three interlocking stigmatizing elements of the meaning of disability, which I'm going to take one by one now. So, the first element could be that there is a necessary sense of defect evoked. The problem with the element of defect is that it should ironically trivialize the emotional, intellectual, and bodily work it takes not to be caught in the logic of ableism. At the same time, it could deliver for the able-bodied gaze the understanding that Daniel's condition is that of medicalized disability. However, we could argue that his condition is that of social injustice. What mothers like Sandra Voiter and sons like Daniel need is rights and recognition, the denaturalization of entitlements of the perfect body, and reconfiguring it as a matter of politics and work. As Ali Care powerfully puts it, quote, "For me, having cerebral palsy is like having blue eyes and red hair. I simply do not know my body any other way," end of quote. The second dimension of entanglement of the association of disability with defect is body shame. Instead of the shortcut to some unwarranted promise of cure that can only indirectly invoke some bodily or intellectual wrongness, we should need to find ways of giving space for Daniel's own understanding of his feelings of grief, disgust, anger, or hatred. These are powerful or even overwhelming emotions, but lived in a space that is not inflicted by the routine naming that should invite a discourse of shame for him. The formation of such a space includes the decision if the people concerned are willing or able to be visible and exposed to some public scrutiny. We could therefore interpret the director's decision not to have any flashbacks about Daniel's life after the car accident as an act that grants the privacy that is not an option for the disabled body that is constantly exposed to the scrutiny of the medical gaze. And finally, the third element entangled in the meaning of defect or disability is the idea of compulsory normalcy. We should try to disentangle the so-called disabled life forms from the sense of disorder by dissociating the diagnosis from non-ordinary, to allow for living one's disabled bodies as familiar and ordinary may subvert the power that the medical gaze may hold on them. The deconstruction of these three elements could allow for a disability politics that does not confine those concerned to a disabled body. For a closure, I don't sum up my points, okay? I would rather like to open up the trajectory of further analysis bringing back Puar's work. The film does not problematize Puar's major concern about Crip nationalism. Yet, if we argue for a social framing of disability, it could be a valuable point for critical research to consider how contemporary economic imperialism drives on disability as a way of selecting and preparing bodies for economic production, manufacturing disabled bodies as an effect of consolidating notions of normative embodiment. Within a social framing of disability, we should consider the role of disaster capitalism in creating and maintaining economies of disability, drawing on Puar, who makes a compelling point about how the social practice of debilitation is constitutive of neoliberal capitalism. Part of this analysis could also invite a critique that exposes the limits of inclusive pedagogy and research, the marginalization of inclusivity at the intersection of producing multicultural subjects in education instead, and the intensified domestication of critical pedagogy and research in a society of post-democracy that centralizes decision making in all fields of social life, teacher training included, while generating a general sense of disaffected consent, as argued by Jeremy Gilbert. Against this tendency of disaffected consent, I think we need to try to reintegrate the political back in the pedagogical and the academic and embrace the concept of debilitation. Thank you for your attention.